You're very welcome back to Sunday AM. Now, 130 people died in the Paris attacks, but in the weeks since there has been a deadly attack in Mali, several sieges in France and Belgium, and numerous false alerts. France has now declared war on the Islamic State, or IS, but who are they and what do they want?
Terrorism may have changed, but the death, destruction and fear it leaves behind hasn't. Joining us now to discuss the terror group are Declan of Crisis Leadership and Communications Consultant, and Dr. James Fitzgerald, Lecturer in Terrorism Studies at Dublin City University. You're both most welcome. James, when you deal with Provisional IRA, Basque separatists, you have a pretty clear idea of what their political agenda is, the United Ireland, independence. What is it that ISIL wants? Do they want us all to convert to Islam? Do they want their own state, or what?
Well, I think the first place to start here is that it's important not to give in to the kind of, the hyperbolic rhetoric that they put out. That, they put out this image that we want to change the fate of, thousands of people across Europe and elsewhere. I think for ISIS, it's a little bit more straightforward. They are gaining more and more territory in Syria and into Iraq. They want to expand that territory, just like, classic kind of insurgency groups, but they also use, terrorism as a tactic to spread fear, not only in Syria and Iraq, but also throughout Europe. So I think it's more about, gaining more and more territory, becoming more important, becoming more attractive for potential recruits to come over from Europe and elsewhere, and to maintain control and power.
I'm still not quite clear, Declan. I mean, is it that in, the northern part of Iraq, a certain part of East Syria, that they want to set up their own state with Sharia law, with really fundamental approach to life, or what?
Well, I think it's a mistake to just look at them in isolation, and that's what we tend to do in the West, particularly in Europe after the attacks. What we're looking at is another iteration of an ongoing, centuries-old civil war between Sunni and Shia, and they're the most extreme example. And they are, in their own minds, the purest of the pure of Sunni Muslims, and anyone who isn't up to their standard gets put to the sword. That's their ideology.
So is that a civil war in every country where there are Shias and Sunni? Is that it?
Well, to an extent. And if you look at what's happening in Syria, they're there's a kind of a proxy war going on. The Iranians are backing one particular side, the regime, Assad regime, and they've pulled in Hezbollah from Lebanon to do the foot soldiering in a very effective way. The regime would no doubt have fallen without Hezbollah and their effectiveness on the ground. And then you have ISIS, Daesh, call them what you will, down there holding ground, and then the plethora of other groups. Now, the problem is, if the West just focuses on defeating Daesh, it's not going to solve the problem fully. And then the other side to it is, why have they started this particular element of their terrorist campaign? And I would argue that they've lost a little bit of ground. They lost Sinjar, actually just before the attack in Paris. They've fallen back south of Aleppo in the face of regime forces. And it's a very sensible thing from their point of view.
And what's the difference between Al-Qaeda and IS?
Well, Al-Qaeda would have had a kind of subsidiary group called Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. And what happened was that, the Islamic State of Iraq joined up with al-Nusra Front to create what they said is ISIL. But Al-Qaeda rejected this. They rejected it on a number of bases, and one of the bases was that they didn't agree with how far that ISIS were prepared to go in terms of using beheadings and so on and so forth. So I think ISIS are far more, barbaric, far more irrational from the perspective of Al-Qaeda leaders. It's funny to think, but you had Ayman al-Zawahiri.
So you're saying Al-Qaeda were moderates?
Well, not moderates, but, there are degrees, so they're less, seem to be less barbaric, seem to be
Declan, talk to us about the recruitment process, because I think there's great concern around that, isn't there? I mean, one of the suicide bombers was said to be a 19-year-old Belgian. So it seems they're younger and younger all the time. Yeah,
that's an interesting process, because just to touch on what you were saying, the ISIS are, engaged in a kind of competition. What was mentioned there about Jabhat al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda, ISIS are now seen as most extreme. And the more spectaculars they do, the more they appeal to a potential recruitment base. And that recruitment base, particularly in Europe, as we've touched on there just before we went on air, young people who aren't necessarily growing up in fundamentalist Muslim households, but they're dislocated, they're disaffected, they're looking for something to belong to, and the more extreme the organisation, the more attracted to it they are. And
so I don't get, what is the attraction of being a suicide bomber?
Well, it's not so much a suicide bomber.
But it is a death cult.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But it's within the broader younger Muslim population, they're seen as taking the fight to the establishment. It's an anti-establishment impulse that
so
any
for
teenager...
young teens maybe who don't necessarily fit in with society, they're looking for that sense of belonging,
precisely,
a member of a club, so to speak.
And coupled with the potent use of online means, the online world, and they have become very adept and competent at using that to recruit. And there's one other point we shouldn't forget. We tend to think of them purely as lunatics that can't be reasoned with. We forget that the old Sunni officer corps of Saddam's army are the ones who are doing the military planning. There are also Chechens who fought the Russians for a long time. So there is a kind of a military brain there on the ground. It's not purely irrational religious ideologues. And it's this mix of that ideology with a bit of military know-how that has made them so potent.
But you see, this, like when the IRA were planting bombs in Birmingham, they ran away. I mean, they detonated it a good bit away. They weren't close to the shrapnel going off, which sounds to me as a good idea for self-preservation. I mean, this idea that, you know, you're going to die as part of the mission in Paris strikes me as requiring a level of commitment that's quite extraordinary.
It is a very strong level of commitment, but I would also argue that throughout time, not only for terrorist groups, but, you know, various different figures throughout history, you've always had martyrs. And the history of suicide bombing goes back, you know, to 1983 with Hezbollah and the truck bombing in the US Embassy in Beirut. But we have to note as well, it's not just about this kind of religious fundamentalist ideology that, you know, justifies the use of suicide terrorism. The LTTE, which were a terrorist organization involved in Sri Lanka, were responsible for more suicide attacks up until 2003, 2004 than all of the other groups put together. And this is a conflict that was not defined by religious
Today's
terms.
papers talk about jihadis in Ireland.
Yes.
Should we be worried?
Well, we should be concerned, and there are up to 30 or 40, according to Minister Shatter in recent statements to the media, that 40 Irish passport holders went to fight. Now, what we should remember before we get too spooked by that is that there are layers within layers. The Islamic community are not one uniform mass. There are people that I would know of who went out to fight, and it was their version of the Spanish Civil War. They felt they were fighting despotism. Some of them would have gotten radicalised and would have fought with the groups most likely to take the fight to the Assad regime.
Why shouldn't we be worried?
Well, because not all of them are necessarily going to come home and want to do damage here. Some of them, like young American soldiers, young UK soldiers, will come home disillusioned and sick of war. That's a truism that we need to take on board. Having said that, the most important thing to keep ourselves safe and to contain an attack is intelligence gathering and sharing of information, and doing so in a partnership. The one thing that an organisation like ISIS fear, it's not a bombing campaign from the air as such, it is unity, facing a unified enemy. And if Europe and the West can unify...
I have to disagree. If, God forbid, there's an incident in Dublin, people will say, you let these guys walk around here.
Well, are you talking about suspending our rights?
Well, so if they're either jihadis or they're not.
Well, you're giving the jihadis the victory if you start to... We're an open society. Look, we have seen dissident terrorism whereby a policeman can be shot in the back of the head. There are some things you can't protect against. You have to, go about your daily existence. But we're obsessed at the moment in our ability to react to a terrorist attack. What we should be focusing on is preventing the means of the terrorist attack in the first place. And that will be done, that heavy lifting will be done in the quiet margins. And we need to ensure that we're partnered up so we can do that effectively.
In a word, will they be defeated?
I think eventually, but I don't think they will be defeated by increasing military engagements in Syria and Iraq. You know, we've seen over time that that doesn't work. We saw it with the Iraq War. This only fans the flames of a rhetoric that says it's us versus them. It's exactly what ISIS wants, and I don't think that is the way forward.
James, Declan, thank you both.